Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
True crime with a dash of the paranormal, the garish, the strange, and the darkly comic. I'm Zevin Odelberg, and you've found your way to Kinda Murdery, a place that means more than just murder. It's my very own pocket dimension, home to a curated collection of bizarre and compelling stories, the unsolved, the unsettling, and the unbelievable. I cover it all, just so long as it's kinda murdery. He was brandishing 2 pistols. Fred immediately recognized Otto from the factory and became exceedingly and understandably angry. The 2 men struggled, and the guns went off. Hello everyone, and welcome to Kinda Murdery. I'm your host, Zevin Odelberg. Thank you for deciding to spend your time hanging out with me. As I mentioned at the top of every show, I have cerebral palsy, and to anyone out there who may be living with a disability, or have a friend or a loved one who's living with a disability, whether it's physical, mental, or emotional, whatever your challenge is, I'm here for you. Please do reach out to the show and share your story with me, and then, if you'd like me to, I'll share it with the audience, and if not, we can just support each other privately. kindamurdery@gmail.com or @kindamurdery on social media. Also, a lot of you have probably already heard about this, but just in case, there's a new 3-digit phone number you can call for support. As of a couple days ago, you can now dial 988 to receive suicidal, substance use, or mental health related crisis support. So if you'd like to share your story and connect with me, again, please email the show, kindamurdery@gmail.com, or reach out on social media @kindamurdery. If you feel like you're facing a more acute crisis, I ask that you please remember that even if you can't feel it, you are loved. People do care. I care. And if you need to talk to someone right now, you can dial 988 and talk to a person who cares about you right away. All right. Thank you for giving me a moment to share that. Now, before we dive in, I'd like to give source material shoutouts to Elena Ferrerin at AETV.com's True Crime blog, Anna Landenois from MilwaukeeMag.com, Aaron Kelly from AllThat'sInteresting.com, and of course, as always, Newspapers.com, and in particular, an article entitled Phantom to Tell Court of Weird Murder, written by Don Roberts and published in the Kenosha News on April 22nd, 1930. I'll post links in the show notes. And now, it's time to get down to business. Kinda murdery business. Today, I'll be telling you the story of Wahlburga, known as Dolly Osterreich, a wealthy housewife and apparently irresistible sex pot from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and her 17-year-old lover, who became more of a willing sex slave, really, Otto Sandhuber, who she originally began secretly smashing behind her husband Fred's back in 1913. Speaking of Milwaukee, if you'll indulge me real quick, I was just in Wisconsin last weekend to soak in the magically therapeutic mineral waters of Fish Lake and hang with the SoCal deep spawners. Shout out to my friend Mike Butson and his lovely wife Jennifer for being the best possible hosts that any podcaster or frankly any person could hope to call friends. Wisconsin this time of year is heaven on earth. All right, let's get back to Wahlburga Osterreich, whose husband Fred was a wealthy Milwaukee apron manufacturer. In 1918, the couple would move to Los Angeles, and Wahlburga's now 22-year-old lover, Otto Sandhuber, would follow her to the City of Angels. But Otto was no angel. He was more of a creature of the night who newspapers would eventually dub the Batman. That's right, the Batman. Interestingly, the moment Sandhuber was nicknamed the Batman, his voice dropped 4 octaves and he developed an almost irresistible urge to fight crime after dark, clad only in black rubber fetish wear, which I suppose is on brand for a sex slave. I kid. Sandhuber wasn't that Batman. but he would earn the name years before Bruce Wayne was created by Bill Finger and Bob Kane. And yes, I intentionally put Bill Finger's name first, but that's another story. Speaking of Batman, I'll be at San Diego Comic-Con starting today through Sunday, and I've got a bunch of pretty slick, full-color vinyl Kinda Murdery stickers to hand out. I'll be wandering around fanboying, and maybe you'll find me. In fact, if you're going to be at San Diego Comic-Con too, reach out to me at Kinda Murdery on social media or kindamurdery@gmail.com, and maybe I'll find you. Okay, so what's up with Wahlburga? Why did they call her boy toy Otto Sanhuber the Batman? And when does this story get Kinda Murdery? Well, in order to properly understand the answer to those questions, I have to begin with a serendipitous occurrence in my own home earlier this week. My daughter Daisy, who you've heard on the show before, walked up to me in the kitchen and said, "Hey Dad, have you heard of frogging?" I had not heard of frogging, which I conveyed to her, although I immediately thought of leapfrogging, which caused my brain to spell the word frogging F-R-O-G-G-I-N-G. What is that, I thought? Did it have something to do with one of my favorite Key and Peele sketches?
These Terrys come up in here trying to act froggy. Then we gonna give them the rainbow connection. Yeah, froggy.
Unlikely. I braced myself, waiting for Daisy to deliver an Urban Dictionary-style definition that I would immediately wish she didn't know. It turns out my assumptions were way off. Frogging is in fact spelled P-H-R-O-G-G-I-N-G and has nothing at all to do with frogs, or whatever it was I was afraid Daisy may have discovered. So what is frogging, and what does it have to do with the story of Wahlburga and the Batman? Let's talk about it. The crime of individuals secretly living in someone's home is known as frogging with a PH. It's a reference to how frogs leap from place to place, and it's pronounced as though it were spelled the way that I thought, so I guess you could say it has something to do with frogs, but not really. Now, frogging with a PH can take many forms, from transient intruders to more permanent ones, in occupied homes or ones where the owner is not in residence. Victims often sense something is amiss, but easily doubt themselves and hesitate to seek help, at least at first. Is frogging real? You bet your life it is, said retired Massachusetts detective Tom Lane. Lane investigated a famous case in 1986, long before the term was coined, involving 17-year-old Daniel LaPlante, who was obsessed with fellow teen Tina Bowen. LaPlante managed to sneak into the Bowen home, where he found a hiding place in a wall cavity next to the bathroom. He started taunting Tina and her family by emitting strange noises, drinking leftover milk, and changing TV channels. One day, he took Tina, her sister, her father, and a friend hostage with a hatchet. Tina was able to escape and run to a neighbor for help. LaPlante fled, but returned to the Bowen home a few days later. He was spotted through a window by Tina's father, who called the police. Lane credits the work of Officer Stephen Bezanson, now also retired, who used his skills as an avid hunter to hone in on LaPlante's hiding spot. LaPlante was arrested. 2 months later, while out on bail, he committed a horrific crime. He broke into the home of Priscilla Gustafson, raped her, and killed her and her 2 young children. He was captured after Massachusetts' largest manhunt in 20 years. LaPlante was convicted of the 3 murders and is serving 3 consecutive life sentences. Lane says this was the most bizarre and disturbing case in his entire law enforcement career. There is no doubt in my mind we're dealing with a cold, calculating individual, Lane said. He took pleasure in the voyeurism initially, but ultimately that wasn't quite enough. Would LaPlante have killed Tina and her family? Very likely, Lane says. Tina prevented that by escaping. She was the hero. LaPlante's crimes came at a steep price for the Bowen family, who endured lasting trauma. Until his early death, Tina's father felt guilty that he didn't believe his daughters when they told him strange things were happening at home. Even we, the police, had some thoughts of, is this really happening? Lane recalls. It was so unbelievable, but it was real. As a cop, you can't dismiss it. And a frogger could be someone close to you. Connecticut detective Terry Lavallo investigated a stalking case in 2017. It involved a man who tormented his estranged wife while staying in her home in an unhinged attempt to rekindle their marriage. While not a typical case of frogging, it has many of the same elements. The woman had a child from a previous relationship, and her husband sometimes stayed in the home a few days at a time to take care of the child while the woman was away on business. The woman began to notice strange things: banging on the roof, missing jewelry, clothing, and underwear, beer cans and cigarette butts strewn on her property. She found her kitchen cabinets wide open and her car tires slashed. It's terrifying. Police eventually determined that the culprit was the husband, whose palm print matched a palm print on a threatening Christmas card that had been sent to the woman. He told me he wanted to be her hero, Detective Lavallo says. He was terrorizing her, hoping that she would call him to make her feel safe. It was his way of getting back into her life. Ultimately, the husband pleaded guilty to threatening and reckless endangerment. The woman, who asked for anonymity to protect her and her child's privacy, says that all along her husband played the supportive role while committing crimes from inside her own home. This is not a stranger in my attic, she says. It happened in my home and under my nose, and it was designed to make me question my sanity. It was a case of horrifying gaslighting. The woman says she and her child were diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and got therapy. She continues to have persistent bad dreams, obsessively locks doors and windows, and suffers from an enduring mistrust of her own judgment. There's a lot of shame associated with it and thoughts of, how could I not know this, she adds. I never, in a million years, thought I could be such a poor judge of character. But that's what sociopaths do to their victims. This case was especially perverse because it came from someone close to the victim. The abuser, says Detective Lavallo, is witnessing the trauma they are creating in the victim. You have to wonder if that gives them some sort of a bizarre level of excitement. What kind of person does that? Especially to someone they love. Okay. Deep breath. Shake it off. These are all terrifying examples, and they show just how horrific frogging can be. Lucky for us, the frogging in today's story is a little more lighthearted. Granted, it still involves adultery, murder, and arguably sex slavery, so clearly lighthearted is an inappropriate word. But the point I'm making is that the real story of this particular frogging case is a little more complicated and a lot more entertaining than just murder and sex slavery, so let's jump into Wahlburga and the Batman. Wahlburga, known as Dolly Osterreich, was a housewife in her early 30s, married to the owner of a Milwaukee apron factory. Her husband, Fred, was successful and worked long hours, but Dolly had needs, and Fred was either too busy or too drunk to meet them. One warm autumn day in 1913, Dolly found that her sewing machine wasn't working. She called Fred to vent her frustration, and he promised to send over a repairman. The young man that showed up to fix it was 17-year-old Otto Sanhuber. Dolly must have figured that Fred would send Otto over because she knew the teenager worked for Fred at the factory. When Otto arrived, he was met by the alluring Dolly wearing only a robe and stockings. Thus began a bizarre affair that would last a decade. And I'll post a picture on Instagram of Wahlburga Dolly Osterreich so you can all see just how alluring, or maybe not, she was. But she must have had incredible charisma or physical skills or both, because Otto was not the only man under her spell. At first, Dolly and Otto conducted their relationship in the usual secretive manner, meeting in hotels to have sex. After a while, meeting outside the home became burdensome, and the two began having sex in Osterreich's bed. Soon, though, nosy neighbors began asking about the man who'd been hanging around, and Dolly told them he was her, quote, vagabond half-brother. Realizing that they were drawing attention to themselves, Dolly decided that Otto should take up residence in the attic of the Osterreich home. That way, he'd never be spotted coming or going. Otto quit his job at the factory and having virtually no family, began to spend all the time not spent in Dolly's bed, in his hideaway within the house. But this new arrangement meant that Otto couldn't ever leave the attic or prying eyes would notice. He remained sequestered there, working on writing pulp fiction stories that he'd hoped to have published. At night, he read mysteries by candlelight and wrote stories of adventure and lust. By day, he made love to Dolly Osterreich, helped her keep house, and make bathtub gin. For 5 years, Dolly and Otto carried on this odd relationship, with Otto living in the cramped attic. So, when Fred informed Dolly in 1918 that he thought they should sell the house and move to Los Angeles, things could have gotten complicated. For a less enterprising woman, this might have been the end of access to her very convenient and very willing, but let's be honest, sex slave. Well, Dolly couldn't have that, so instead, she found a house overlooking Sunset Boulevard with an attic, and she sent Otto there early ahead of herself and Fred, so that when she arrived in Los Angeles, he'd be waiting for her, already ensconced in the secret attic sex slave compartment that she'd arranged to have built by a Los Angeles carpenter. This is a true story, ladies and gentlemen. Dolly was one enterprising nympho. And even after the move to Los Angeles, life continued on for Otto and Dolly in exactly the same way it had in Wisconsin for 4 more years. So, if you're counting, that's now 9 years of willing sex slavery for young Otto Sandhuber, who at this point is 26. And then, on August 22nd, 1922, Otto overheard Dolly and Fred fighting from inside his attic bolt hole. He burst into the room where the Osterreichs were quarreling. He was brandishing 2 pistols. Fred immediately recognized Otto from the factory and became exceedingly and understandably angry. The 2 men struggled, and the guns went off. Fred was shot, and Otto and Dolly panicked. Otto locked Dolly in a closet from the outside, taking the key and the guns with him to the attic. He knew neighbors would report the gunshots, and this way Dolly would have an alibi. She couldn't have shot her husband while locked away. When the police arrived, Dolly indeed told them of a burglary where the robbers shot Fred, took some expensive belongings, and then locked her in a closet before fleeing. The police were somewhat distrustful of the story, but they couldn't prove it wasn't true, so they released her. Now that Dolly Osterreich was a widow, she moved into a new house and continued on with her life. One would assume that she and Otto would eventually bring their relationship into the open, allowing Otto to have a normal life. But instead, when Dolly moved, her voluntary live-in sex slave took up residence in her attic again. Otto Sandhuber had managed to get a few pulp stories published, and with this money, plus a few nickels and dimes here and there from Dolly, he purchased a typewriter to keep writing. All of this while Dolly managed to get herself a new lover, lawyer Herman S. Shapiro. But, like Dolly's first husband, Shapiro spent long hours away due to his profession. Enter Roy Klum, another lover to keep Dolly occupied, though her use of Klum may have been to help her get rid of the guns used to shoot Fred. Dolly persuaded him to ditch a gun for her, saying it resembled the burglar's gun and she didn't want to get in trouble. Klum tossed it in the La Brea tar pits. She then sweet-talked a neighbor into burying the other gun in his yard. So, when Dolly eventually broke up with Klum a while later, he went to the police with the story. The gun was pulled from the tar pits and Dolly was taken into custody. Her neighbor dug up the other gun and took it to the cops, but neither weapon could be tied to Dolly because the guns had corroded. While Dolly was awaiting trial in jail, she pleaded with Shapiro to buy groceries for Sandhuber and to tap on the ceiling of the bedroom closet to let him know he should come out. She also tried to tell Shapiro that the attic-bound Sandhuber was her vagabond brother. But, starved for conversation with another male after 9 years kept as Dolly's sex slave in the attic, Sandhuber spilled the truth to Shapiro about the nature of his and Dolly's relationship. Shapiro essentially told Sandhuber to get lost, and then he went and got Dolly released on bail. Apparently, the fact that she had kept a man in her attic was not a deal-breaker, as the lawyer promptly moved in with her. All charges against Dolly Osterreich were dropped. That is, until 7 years later when things became irreparable between Dolly and Shapiro. He moved out and told the police what he'd gathered of the crime against Fred Osterreich. Warrants were once again issued for Dolly and this time Sanhuber as well. A jury found Sanhuber guilty of manslaughter even after his defense stated that Dolly had enslaved him. Sanhuber became known as the Batman since he had been kept in a secluded cave-like attic. This lurid true story of sex, murder, and romantic enslavement captured the imagination of the country and became known as the Batman case, and Sanhuber himself was dubbed the Batman since he'd been kept in a secluded cave-like attic. Nevertheless, the statute of limitations on the manslaughter had run out, and Sanhuber was a free man. As for Dolly Osterreich, she went to trial on a conspiracy charge, but also walked free after a hung jury. The indictment was eventually dropped in 1936, and she died in 1961 at the age of 80, perhaps having learned a thing or two about relationships. I hope you enjoyed the story of Wahlburga and the Batman, and I hope I see you at San Diego Comic-Con. I'm Zevin Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery. If you've enjoyed today's Kinda Murdery, please tell your friends and family, tell strangers, leave a review. It's the best way to ensure that I can keep telling that special brand of bizarre and terrible tales that you'll only find here on Kinda Murdery.